This is probably going to shock you, but I actually switched from Sony to Panasonic back in 2020. And I'd honestly say 90% of the reason for that was autofocus. At the end of 2019, I began the journey that ended up with me buying the Panasonic S1H in the middle of 2020. And it all had to do with my shooting style. I, back in 2019, had been, one of those Sony shooters, exclusively shooting on autofocus, 35-1.4, 1080-120 for all the things, the gimbals. That was my vibe. But going into 2020, one of my goals was to get better at interviews, to learn how to tell a visual story without relying on all of the slow motion and all of the technology that we have today, to capture things extremely quickly. So I only was shooting 24p. I had my camera rigged out in a cage and a top handle and the monitor and all the things because I wanted to get better at exposure. I wanted to be able to be a more well-rounded filmmaker, and relying on autofocus and all the tools in mirrorless cameras was not going to allow me to get to the level I wanted to with being able to actually shoot more, hate the word, but cinematic stories. Fast forward, the S1H at the time was pretty much the only option on the market that would allow me to have full-size XLRs using their XLR adapter, have great IBIS. At the time, Vlog was pretty much one of the best picture profiles for that budget range. You would have to go up to something like a FX9 in the Sony world, or like a Canon C500 Mark II at the time from Canon. So the S1H was fitting within my budget, and it had all the features I was looking for. The perfection and final form of all this was picking up an Atomos Ninja V in the middle of last year to start shooting ProRes and ProRes RAW, but more on that later. Okay, so we have to get all of the cons out of the way because I think, this camera, in my opinion and for my use case, is about as close to perfect as humanly possible. But I will admit there are a few things that I wish were a little bit better. Addressing the elephant in the room, autofocus. It's absolutely horrible. But in my use case, I've never used it because I have exclusively shot this camera using adapted lenses. The Sigma MC21 is their L-mount to EF adapter, is absolutely fantastic. It was only a couple $100 at the time of buying it, and it basically allows me to use all of my EF lenses, and I get full aperture control, metadata for IBIS purposes, and everything works great. I honestly I shoot primarily the 35-1.4. I also have the 24-1.4, 50-1.2, 100 millimeter macro L, and the 24-70 version 2. Ideally, I'd like to have a 70-200 in there, but I haven't actually needed one, so who knows? Maybe that's just a pipe dream and I don't actually need it. The second and third things are kind of nitpicky for me at this point. In 2020, I spent an enormous amount of time learning audio because I learned, as a person shooting on a mirrorless camera, the biggest ways I could differentiate my work from others around me was the quality of the audio I was putting out. And from a practicality standpoint, I think a lot of filmmakers are pretty guilty of utilizing high level music and like hypiness to hide the fact that their audio doesn't sound as good. And something that I noticed for my films is I was able to get my messages across a lot more clearly, focusing on that audio quality because it allowed me to bring down the volume of my music and use it for emphasis rather than hiding bad recordings. So, all that being said, The S1H only has 16-bit audio 48K in camera. The last con in my book is the crop in 4K 60. I tried to get around this by shooting a wedding at 1080 60, thinking using the full area of the sensor would provide me with way better sensitivity for low light and all that stuff. And I shot 24 to 70 f2.8, thinking everything was going to be great, and I ended up having to buy neat video just to get an acceptable image out of the whole thing. The next wedding I shot 4K 60 and just had to live with the crop. But to counteract that, I shot primarily on the 24-1.4, so I got that extra bit of light gathering to be able to overcome the smaller sensor area that I was using. Okay, moving on to the pros. Now, I think it goes without saying, I think Vlog is probably one of the best picture profiles in a mirrorless camera on the market right now. And maybe that's something to do with the way Panasonic's processing works with the sensor that they're using. But I feel like it just has a significantly smoother highlight roll-off than anything that I'm getting out of my Sony FX3, Canon R6, or, I mean, the only camera that I've used that has a smoother highlight roll-off than the S1H is the Canon C70, and that's just like the undisputed dynamic range king of sub $10,000 cinema cameras, so no complaints there. The other factor that absolutely drew me to Vlog, as someone who is just getting into learning color grading, the fact that Panasonic has 33 different LUTs in their Vlog LUT library allowed me to explore and play around with different looks that I could get essentially straight out of camera without having to do a ton of work. Just drop it in, go. Make a couple tweaks here and there, and I was starting to like really develop some looks that I liked, and being able to use a different log to Rec 709 conversion allowed me to play around with some of the creative LUTs I had already bought to mix and match and create some different unique looks from there. So as someone who's getting into color, I think that having a good back-end workflow is just as important as the camera having really good dynamic range. If Canon did something like this, I'm sure you would not be seeing as many people complaining about how bad C-Log 3 is on the internet. I wholeheartedly believe that. Okay, now let's get into the top handle. This is arguably one of the best features about the S1H that I think even with competition from Sony and Tascam bringing out that universal adapter for Canon, Fuji, Nikon, and all of the other cameras, Panasonic still, I think, takes the cake because they allow you to record 24-bit 96K audio. Now, there's going to be a whole lot of debate, and I promise I, at some point, sit down and talk with someone that knows audio a little bit better than I do to kind of work through the kinks. But from my base understanding, being able to record 96K is what most people use when you're recording sound effects and those types of things. And if you're recording a lot of natural sound or events or those types of things where you're not necessarily capturing directly a human voice, which you probably should max out at 48K for a whole bunch of cleanliness reasons, but when you're recording sound effects or people moving things around or those types of things, 96K is going to be the move because it will allow you to have that like top end sparkle is the best way to describe it. I think of things like keys rattling or, the shaking of a door or something like that, where you hear those like super high frequencies. And even if you don't hear them, you feel them in a more emotional way than if you didn't have those in your recording. Moving on from the XLR module, I think the biggest, most underrated thing on Panasonic cameras is their IBIS. Now, I kind of have a love-hate relationship with it. In the S1H, it's 100% necessary because the rolling shutter on this camera is atrocious. And if you turn off the IBIS, you're going to be getting jello-y artifacts in every single video clip, no matter how stable you think you are. But the one problem that I actually only noticed it in severe backlit situations is you get this like, I don't even know what to call it. I'll put a sample of it up on the screen and try and point it out, but like you get these dancing light flares. And the best way, and I think I've seen people talk about this before, but the best way to describe it is like the sensor is able to move so much and it's doing its job so well that while your frame will look super still and stable doing its job, it also does such a good job that anything that's supposed to be still in the frame will now appear to be moving. But overall, I would say the IBIS in the S1H is pretty much undisputed king of IBIS outside of maybe like the GH6, but smaller sensor, easier to stabilize, all those things. I absolutely love it. And also the size and weight of the S1H being such a tank that it is also contributes to the ability to get exponentially smoother shots when you're walking around or anything like that, because you're not carrying such a small camera body. You have that little bit of extra weight, similar to the handheld look when you use something like a Red or an RE or the Venice 2. Because those cameras are so big, you don't get the same micro jitters, which rigging out my S1H with a V mount and everything, I'm noticing that a lot more in my footage. The heavier my rig is, the smoother everything tends to be because I don't have that same micro jitter. Okay, my favorite and final point to the S1H being one of the most underrated cameras on the internet, and also just an overall camera that you can actually grow with, is the ability to record ProRes RAW. Anyone that's ever gone from color grading 8-bit video to 10-bit video will tell you, oh my gosh, it's like I have information to work with. I can play with my colors now. This is so great. And I had that exact same experience switching to the S1H. Fast forward last year, I shot my first project in ProRes RAW, and let me tell you, 250 gigs for 15 minutes of video footage is really hard to swallow. And I'll be honest, I've only shot that one test project. The editing of the colors on that video was an absolute dream to work with. And I think the difference between 10-bit and 12-bit video is a lot more than most people are going to be telling you on YouTube. And it's honestly impossible to show what those differences are going to be. And it all comes down to like gradients and color tonality and the ability to not necessarily get more dynamic range out of the image, but just being able to work with those colors in a more finely tuned way than you could with even 10-bit footage. In conclusion, I don't think I can see myself selling my S1H anytime in the foreseeable future. It's a camera that I truly feel like I will be able to grow with over the next several years. And while I have a few goals and things that I'm trying to move towards in my professional career, it will be there along with every single future purchase that I have. Because, in my opinion, it's probably one of the first cameras that I truly feel like I was actually able to tell the stories and create the videos I wanted without any compromise. So, hopefully, this was helpful, and not that I'm going to be convincing you to go out and buy an S1H right now when the S5 Mark II just came out and does everything the S1H does, plus actually has usable autofocus. Anyways, I'm going to be rambling if I don't stop and end this video anytime soon. So, my name is Brandon Goodyear. If you enjoyed any of this, please like, subscribe, do all of the things, and I'm hopefully going to be making more of these. I just started a little bit of a challenge with a friend, and we are going to be trying to put out videos once a week every Monday just to get those reps in. So I will see you in the next one.